It's Thursday, 12:30 in Berlin, and it's Space Cafe time. So our Space Cafe Law Breakfast with Steven Freeland will begin soon. Thanks for joining us today for our breakfast roundtable and to see you in this wonderful bagel shop environment we came together. As always, we really appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback. I'm Torsten Kriening, your co-host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global, and we are a Berlin-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. And I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, the Space Cafe podcast, and our Space Cafe radios, and of course our web talks. We also keep our fan shop open for you to become a real space watcher. So if you have missed any of our web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the event section or on YouTube. And we will host our Space Cafe Law Breakfast, as you know, with our wonderful host, Steven Freeland, live on a more or less bi-monthly base. And with that, I'm handing over to your host in Sydney today, Professor Steven Freeland. The floor is yours.
Thank you, my dear friend, and I'm glad you've got a new toy to play with. I hope you don't use it during the next hour or so. Hi, everybody. He just can't help himself. Yeah, it's just great.
I also can censor you, so I don't play with that. So your show.
You see what I've got to put up with every time, you know. Hey, hi, everybody. It's just wonderful to be here. Thanks for joining us for the Space Cafe Breakfast. I cannot tell you how much I've been looking forward to this one. We've just got two of the most amazing people that you'll ever want to hear from as our guests. I'll introduce them in a minute. This is Torsten, our 11th Space Cafe Law Breakfast. So it's almost becoming an institution. You know, we're into season 2 soon. So our rates.
I think we are on 10 now. It's our 10th.
Is it?
I mean, today is the 11th. That can be misleading, but the real 11th will be next time.
Maybe I'm just exaggerating to get a higher salary for the next one. Welcome again. Look, space. There's so much going on. You know, all joking aside, these are really, really difficult times, and there's so much involved in terms of what space has to offer. For all of us, of course, the great desire of space is that it's used for peaceful, lawful, legitimate, and sustainable ways. But it's a tough time at the moment, and we've got some amazing guests, and we're going to talk about some really interesting issues that have the capacity of having fantastic benefits for humanity. But if we get it wrong, you know, there are some serious problems. But before we go into all of that, as Torsten mentioned, we're at this fantastic bagel place in Washington as a guest of one of our guests, Christopher Johnson, who I'll introduce more formally in a minute. Hi, Chris. I know it's really early in the morning. It actually is truly breakfast for you. Welcome. Tell us, before anything, tell us where we are, where we're meeting today.
We're just at the local bagel joint in D.C. That's not the franchise chain. That's the mom and pop store that I would take you to if you come see me in D.C. because it's super casual and legit. So I hope to see some of you or all of you there at some point.
Great. Have you got a bagel with you there, Chris? Or
right off camera.
Okay. I know, Torsten, just show your bagel, okay? Because Torsten has the most incredible bagel there. With, you know.
You just said show, not show off, yeah?
Oh.
That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary.
Anyway, Chris, to DC in the morning. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Chris, thank you. Thank you for introducing us to this great place. And I'm sure we'll all look forward to being there with you again. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, as I said, we're going to talk about really important issues, focusing a lot on activities on the moon. The moon, of course, is very much in the news, very much in the discussions around the world at every level. when we talk about space and governance and activities and industry and economy and culture. So we're going to look at what future activities might look like and how practical is it that, as you know, we're working on potential governance structures, and I have the honor of being involved in a lot of that. But is it practical to try to predict what's going to happen in the future and develop, as I always say, laws for the unknown? We're regulating the unknown. But what's going on in terms of those governance structures, and how informed are they? How do we develop norms that will inspire confidence and trust in the various groups that are looking at doing those activities? How do we verify? How do we use technology to verify what's going on? There's so much more. And so let me introduce more formally the two guests that we have. As I said, amazing people, both of them dear friends, and I'm really delighted you're here. First, we've got Dr. Annie Handmer. Annie, you're also in Australia, so where there's a majority of Australians today. I love it. Annie is Associate Lecturer with the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. Her research traces the social history of Australian space science projects so that we can get a better understanding of international and interdisciplinary cooperation, and boy, do we need that at the moment. The social construction of achievement, the nature of the military-industrial academy complex in Australian space science. She also works as Senior Manager, Innovation and Policy for a fantastic company in Australia called Heo Robotics, which is a startup, although it's really moving to the next phase, I would say, a startup which provides on-orbit imaging of space objects. Annie's previously worked in government and in the finance sector. Welcome, Annie. And Christopher Johnson, you've already heard from him, but everybody who knows anything about law or is interested in space law would know of Chris and his work. Chris is a graduate of the Leiden International Institute of Air and Space Law. He's worked at the UNUSA, United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, and for the past 8 years, he's served such an important role as a space law advisor at the Secure World Foundation, which, if you don't know, is an NGO focused on creating cooperative solutions for advancing space sustainability. So our first tradition is, what word would you describe space? As everybody knows, we get all of our guests to try to encapsulate all this complexity of space into the one word that means something for them. Torsten and I have done this with every guest. We can, on the website, we've got a list of all the words. Just to say, Torsten's word was ambiguous, which I thought was a great word, and mine was intergenerational. So Annie, welcome. Thanks for being here. Tell us about space in one word. What and why how would you describe it?
Well, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm joining from Sydney on Gadigal land, and it's a pleasure to be here. My word is delightful, and I chose the word delightful because I think that space law is full of delights.
Okay, do you want to elaborate? That's it? Okay, so space law is full of delights. Oh, well.
It is. It's a gift that keeps on giving. The more you get into space law, the more you're like, this is the best thing ever. You know, you start off like with your first little dip into the outer space treaty. Before you know it, you're up all night reading all of the treaties. You're sitting there with your Cologne commentaries like at the cafe. People are trying to talk to you and you're like, no, I'm busy. I'm watching space law breakfast. It's so good. It's so good.
Oh, look, that's wonderful. And you and I, Annie, teach together. We teach space law, so we are the purveyors of all things delightful. I'm glad to hear it. So delightful, what a great word. Okay, Chris, how do you match that? What's the way that you would encapsulate space in one word?
Well, first, I really like that explanation that Annie just gave, because I know that when I remember back when I was working in New York, not in any way related to international law or space law whatsoever, but just reading about this stuff like at night or taking night classes and reading space law for the first time and kind of telling people about it, these are people that work in like publishing and, advertising and the creative industries. There's something called space law. I think I want to become a space lawyer. Here's a little bit about it. No one could believe it, and it really was, like really delightful to talk about and amazing to talk about when I first explained it to people that such a thing existed. So I definitely can agree with that. The word that I chose now is restrained, because maybe modest is the better word, because when we read the treaties, and even when you read national space law, it doesn't say exactly, it doesn't say what you want to do in space. It just sets the guardrails, the rules that we have, just kind of like the rules of a board game. That doesn't give you a strategy. You don't have to play it this way or that way, but here are the constraints that are placed upon you, whether positive obligations or negative obligations. And so in that sense, it's modest in that it doesn't say what the future is going to be in space, but it gives kind of guardrails.
Oh, that's a really great way of looking at it. But of course, our job, your job, Annie's job, Torsten's job, all of our jobs is to try to work out, as I said before, putting guardrails in place for future activities is always going to be very difficult because, as you say, we don't exactly know what it looks like. So let's delve into all of that. And thank you both. Great words, delightful and restrained. So as I mentioned at the outset, these are incredibly difficult times. There's climate change issues, there's pandemics, pollution, disparities of wealth, and of course, overarching everything at the moment is the scourge of war and threats of geopolitical tension and the tragic human costs that are involved, and all of the consequences that flow. As I said, if ever we need something that brings us together to cooperate between countries and communities, this is the time. And yet, with some of the major space activities, there are threats about cooperation. Perhaps different countries, different groups of countries might be looking, for example, when we talk about activities on the moon and then beyond, to do different activities. And, we don't yet, I think, have a general comprehensive framework to cover all of that. So that's what we want to explore here. But I think, having Chris here, we have to take advantage of his incredible wealth of knowledge. So Chris, start us at the beginning if you can, and let's just focus our discussion on the moon, although obviously there's a lot more. But how does existing international space law regulate current and proposed activities on the lunar surface, including, of course, resource exploitation?
Certainly. What an easy question. That I can wrap it up in no time. When you sit down to read the treaties and reread the treaties, you see how often it says, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So by and large, the regime that we have for all of space applies to the moon. And that there's also a few subsections of the treaties where the moon is called out specifically. So by and large, the principles that we have of international space law, of national responsibility, both for national activities and those non-governmental national activities, that direct attribution and direct international responsibility or answerability. International responsibility is that you're answerable for it. And then that element of potential liability for damage. So we're looking at, basic Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, Articles 6 and 7. The idea that, outer space is an area beyond national territory, but states still have the right to have jurisdiction and control over their national space objects, which they list on their national register. Jurisdiction is, the legal rights, and then control is a more operational right. And then, beyond that, the idea that, what we have in Article 9 on due regard, the states shall show due regard to the corresponding interests of other states in the exploration of use of outer space, that prohibition or that prohibition on harmful contamination that we have in Article 9. And then when I talk about, where the moon is called out specifically, you look at Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty that deals with non-weaponization of space, and that the second paragraph of Article 4 specifically calls out and says that the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. We don't know what peaceful purposes really means. We don't know what exclusively for peaceful purposes means, but we know that it means something. We know that it was inserted intentionally. Not just peaceful purposes, but exclusively peaceful purposes, right there in Article 4, paragraph 2. And then a further sentence, the rest of it has a very strong prohibitions on military installations, fortifications, and maneuvers, and the placement or installations of weapons are all prohibited on the surface of the moon. That's a pretty strong encouragement, and to my mind, it talks about, or it speaks to a non-militarization of the moon. Even heightened over the protections given to the rest of space. The moon is someplace which is special. Beyond that, we have the protection of astronauts that we have in Article 5, and that information sharing that we see elsewhere in the Outer Space Treaty. So I think that the interesting thing, the specific thing, we have done space activities for decades, but here, as we return back to the moon, we're not talking about void space or orbits. We're talking about a celestial body. We're talking about a location. We're talking about, some people call the moon, what do they call it? The eighth continent. Because here we are looking at a place where you can land, you can arrive, you can seek shelter. There is gravity, although it's 1/6 the gravity, but it is a place. And so previously we've seen how space law works in orbit, in orbital locations, in LEO and in GEO. Now we're talking about a place that we can do so much more. We can leave things there. We can build things there. We can use the resources there. And that's why it's so interesting for the future of space law, is now we see all those principles apply elsewhere. Now we're going to see them play out in a location that we want to arrive at and develop and use for a variety of purposes.
Well, that's a great answer. But as an Australian, and I know I speak for Annie, the one thing you didn't mention is that other treaty. That other treaty that specifically deals with the moon, and obviously we can talk about that, and we all understand that there are only a relatively small number of states that ratify it, but it is part of space law, of course. But this, the one part, just building on what you said, the one part about exclusively peaceful purposes on the moon, of course, in the moon agreement, it goes even further. And it says, no threats of force or use of force on the moon. It really doubles down on the fact the moon, and of course we know the moon really means the moon and other celestial bodies, is a really special place. And so I totally agree with you, Chris. So really what we take from what you've said is there's quite a lot of law already. I mean, let's put aside the moon agreement, although I think that's an incredibly important document, at least for the 18 states parties. But there's a lot of law. So Annie, we've heard from Chris about that law and the legal framework, but where do you see where there might be, let's say, lacuna, possible gaps that need to be addressed before these activities? And remember, we're not exactly sure what the activities will look like, but before lunar activities begin in earnest, where are the problems? Where are the gaps? How do we fill that in? Annie?
Well, Stephen, you've just glossed over something that I think is quite one of the things I find delightful about space law and fascinating, which is that for Chris, what is space law is different to what it is for Stephen and I. And I just want to kind of touch on that, in that we have kind of the 4 space treaties that that the US and Australia, both parties to, and then you've got this extra one, the Moon Agreement, which has a fewer number of states party to it. But I run into this problem frequently. I was reviewing a book for someone recently, and they had this whole section on space law, and they were like, well, there are these 4 treaties, and I kept going through and saying 5, there are 5, there are actually 5. And because their argument was, well, this is a book being published in the US, written by US authors, and therefore this isn't law. But I was saying, well, it is still a treaty, even if it isn't a treaty that the US has signed or become a party to, it still counts as law. But what I find quite delightful is that despite the fact that across the world there is not just in this case, but with all of space law, this kind of differentiation between what is space law and what isn't space law, even at that very material level of what counts for a particular state. You can still have a conversation about it. We can still work together in international forums to figure it out. So I think that that's really quite special. And so when it comes to gaps, I don't think that gaps or lacunae, as you use the proper terminology, I don't think it's a problem right off the bat. I think it's something we have to be aware of, but it's something that we can solve together. So a few of the ones that have kind of popped up in my brain while we've been talking are, first of all, you've got all your technological challenges of going to the moon. So it's all very well to talk about, well, what's the governance regime? But before you can even conceptualize a governance regime, you have to understand, well, what is it that we can actually do there? It's really non-trivial to send all this stuff there. And as Chris says, to leave things there, to seek shelter, to operate in that gravitational environment, to operate in that physical environment. All of those things are quite challenging technologically. And as much as we have these kind of Moon to Mars initiatives here in Australia and all of NASA's work in the US and all around the world, I think it will be quite a collaborative effort to get ourselves there from a technological standpoint. So that in itself, I think, will then influence the way that we do things there. Another area that I think is really important is the question of ethics. So why are we doing this? Who gets to decide whether we do this? Who gets to be in the conversation about what we do on the moon and when and how and under what circumstances? And if it's mining, what sort of remediation is required and agreed to, and who gets to decide that? And the reason I think this is particularly important is because we have these laws that apply to the moon and other celestial bodies. So the moon is perhaps the first of those celestial bodies that we will go to and do things. But whatever we do there, I think will be an important marker for how that is interpreted, how we interpret our laws for other celestial bodies. So there's a lot at stake there. And then the third thing is questions of assurance. So how do you know that someone's saying saying that they'll do something and then actually doing that thing? The moon's a really long way away. And I think sometimes I forget that as a when I'm staring at pieces of paper, and then I have to kind of remember how big space is. So, and the history of this kind of extractive stuff on Earth reminds us that there's issues with just trusting corporations, that they will act responsibly, and corporations won't necessarily act as responsibly as states. States are accountable in a way that I think corporations are not, even if there are areas in international space law where there is that mechanism to do it. Actually doing it, how do we actually do that? How do you continually supervise? So questions of environmental responsibility and safety and compliance and all of those things, I think, have yet to be figured out. I will stop there.
Well, great. Thank you, Annie, because you've raised so many issues. These issues come up in all the different conversations that are going on. So, Chris, I want to talk to you about those conversations because you're involved in so many different aspects of the way that the civil society and also governments look at this. So there are many conversations going on. There's already law, as you said, but perhaps not enough. There's technological challenges and all sorts of ethical and other issues raised by Annie. We clearly need to find norms of behaviour. We clearly need to find additional rules of the road, not to replace, but to supplement the rules that you've so clearly enunciated for us. So can you describe perhaps some of the conversations that are going on at the different levels? And how, given that they're at the NGO level and the national level, the bilateral, the minilateral, the multilateral, at the industrial level, so that's uncoordinated. And yet in the end, I think what we've heard from both of you is we need to find some common path forward. How do we do that? How do we make sense of all of these conversations, given they're uncoordinated, and to get the maximum leverage from them so that we can move forward in the right way?
Another easy question. Obvious that this guy is a law professor because he can ask questions that you go, you could take that so many different ways. The watchword that I talk about is polycentricity, and it's really Jesse K. Shingler and the folks from Open Lunar who have really stressed that setting norms for the moon is the ideas of polycentricity will apply, and essentially that means that normative development will happen at various competing or cooperative levels. It can happen at the highest level, at the United Nations, with sovereign nation states drafting treaties which may be narrowly defined and specific, like Lunar Cave Treaty or South Pole of the Moon Treaty, or they could be very broadly conceived as not the Moon Treaty 2, but something like a Lunar Exploration Treaty that covers everything from the scientific to the commercial to the all activities on the moon. Could be very broad, done at the very highest level, or they could be at the bilateral level with nation states. Such as Artemis partner countries or the Russia-Chinese partner countries, working things out on a operational level, merely not setting rules in a vague sense, but setting rules and norms that are tied to specific exploration programs. So very pragmatic. If you want to do things with NASA and under the Artemis program and do things on the moon, if you're a country or a commercial entity, here's our rules. It's the Artemis Accords rules. It's tied to a specific program. Underneath that, or also at the national, strictly at the national level, could be national space legislation. And there, it's different entities, different actors, different thinkers and scholars that will be writing those rules. Think of the different mindset between a delegation at COPUOS versus a national regulator, a congressperson, a senator, a legislator. What would they be stressing and coming up with if they are setting rules for the moon? And also, again, different constituency than, say, the principal investigators and leaders pushing for Artemis and Artemis Accords. Those are different actors. They're not competing with each other necessarily. Hopefully all their initiatives are complementary, overlapping, and not conflicting. And then even further down, or I don't say down, but elsewhere, you could have the commercial industrial partners saying, all right, we're going to build this rover on the moon, or we're going to be building this regolith cooker that you grasps lunar regolith and cooks it, and here's the standards that we're going to use, and here's how we're going to sell, and here's how we're going to operate. They're setting norms at the very operational level. So it is not satisfying to say that they're all in competition with each other and we can't predict where they're going to go and they're going to come up with different rules. But that is the reality of it, is that all of those actors will be, when you think about the life cycle of norms, they will all be norm entrepreneurs. They will be setting standards. And so it may be, a COPUOS delegate or international lawyer may have certain ideas of what the rules should be on the moon, but those could be different from what the commercial actor wants to set as norms on the moon, all with these differing viewpoints and philosophies. And I'm not going to say which one is best. It would be wrong to say that, it's always going to be these actors with these viewpoints which are best. And really, who will be successful? Sometimes it's those who come up with the best ideas, meaning, like memes, which are successful, which catch on, which gain traction, which gain acceptance. Who comes up with the best ideas for what norms should be on the moon? Sometimes it comes down to who are the most powerful actors, who are the most successful actors. Sometimes it comes down to their persuasive soft power. And so when I think of COPUOS, I also think that there are states and delegations which you may not think of being the most important actors in space, yet they are the most important delegations at COPUOS. They are very successful delegations, successful diplomats, which know how to work within that system and really know how to socialize their norms in a very successful manner. And that's how these games will play out. Hold on, I don't want to call them games. That's how normative development will happen. It's who does things which catch on and are successful, who does things first, who does things, who's a stronger actor, and who's a very successful norm entrepreneur, who can convince other actors to adhere to their norm.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, you and I, Chris, of course, spend a lot of time at COPOS, and I couldn't agree with you more. You know, it's really amazing in those backroom discussions, and even in the hall itself. You've got the main actors, but you know when a certain delegation or it rises to say something, you know that that's something that's well thought through, that's influential, that's been, you know, tested around the room already. So I completely agree. Nothing is straightforward here, but that's the delight, if you like, of international law, but also that causes the restraints that you talk about. So Annie, you've already heard Chris's view on these initiatives. You've heard Chris's thoughts about norm creation and how, and you know, and Chris was going way beyond legal frameworks there in terms of the creation of these norms and legal methodologies. And amongst your skills, of course, you're a sociologist. You say you take a sociological perspective to space as well. So tell me from your perspective, taking perhaps also this non-legal, even though this is a space law breakfast, hey, we embrace everything here, taking that sociological view and the comments of Chris and extending on that, you know, how are we going to build trust and confidence if, as Chris says, we've got different groups of countries, and you said, how do we protect ourselves from corporates doing the wrong thing? How is it going to work? Can we and how do we develop norms that will build some sort of trust and confidence, even amongst these completing and vested interests? It's an easy question as well. This show is all about easy questions. Over to you, Annie. Solve the world, please.
Once again, Stephen, there's a PhD in that. If anyone
that's right.
in attendance has yet to do a PhD and feels inspired, that's a great topic, and one that I wish I had the answers to. I'll give it a go. I'm going to draw on Chris's analogy of board games. So one way of looking at a board game is to say, well, there is the game and there's the rules, and the rules are defined by what's in the packet. Or maybe is it Hoyle's book of games and rules? It's like the standard rules. That's what it is. But a sociologist would say, okay, so we've got this board game and we've got these rules, but I want to go out and I want to look at how is this game actually played by different groups of people? How does that differ across groups, and how do they intersect when you bring different groups together to play the same game? And the analogy might be something like, any classic game that you played growing up, like Monopoly or that sort of thing, every family has their own rules. And those rules might be, you know, like in my case, when I was growing up playing Boggle, it's a word finder game. When I was Boggle, it's a great game. Yeah. It's like Scrabble. Scrabble will do, right? Everyone knows Scrabble. Boggle's probably a bit obscure. But with Scrabble, there's like the standard rules, but no one plays the standard rules. Everyone has their own rules. And in my house, it was, you know, if it's an expressive word, you get an extra point. Or if Annie is under the age of 6, she can get 2-letter words and that's acceptable. Like, these are the different rules that people come up with in their own families. And when you come together with another family and you play the same board game together, that's when you notice the differences. And suddenly you have to sit down and agree, well, what rules are we playing? It happens with every single game, every game. If you've ever played ping pong, if you've ever played anything with a different group of people, if you play with people from a different city or a different country, it's even more extreme, the differences. And you have to agree, well, what are the rules that we're playing beyond just this is the game that we're playing today? Which is all to say that if you take that sociological standpoint, everything's kind of made up of these social systems that are organized around technologies. And in that case, the technology would be the game and its rules. So in space law, I would say, you know, the technology is the space law itself, the body of treaties, the body of domestic legislation, the body of however else we decide that these are the things that we've written down that constitute space law. But then we have to look at how do we arrange ourselves around that? What happens at UN Copulus? How is it that we do this, even this space law breakfast? We're all having a chat about it. How does that influence things? So we have to understand the technological side and the human side and bring those things together. And the only way to do that is to actually study how it really works in the real world. You have to have that evaluative step before you can get to the normative step of how should it be. But I don't have time to do that. So I'm going to skip the evaluative step, which is very bad practice, and just say a few things on the normative side, which is, I don't think we really have a clear understanding of all of these things. We're trying to apply the rules of the game that were developed for states and then kind of incorporated by this extension of states have responsibility for their own entities to then govern this new space era where you have commercial entities running around doing things. One of the things that I've been working on in kind of my day job is, well, how does that work in reality? And you can take something like debris mitigation guidelines. So UN Copulus have agreed these mitigation guidelines, and they're quite broad and they're principles. And then if you were in Australia, under Australian domestic law, if you want a permit, you have to use an internationally recognised set of guidelines and have a debris mitigation strategy. You can choose which one you want, and you can choose from, say, NASA or IADC or who knows, the ISO regulations. You pick what is most appropriate and then you interpret them. And in doing so, you're actually creating another set of house rules, which we call in the corporate world best practice. And that then influences what other people do. I think that if we take a step back from the international law and from what's written down as the rules, and we look at how is it being interpreted, what is the best practice, we may find that there is a pathway through, as Chris says, where people can discuss what is the best way and convince each other that my way is better, and develop those kinds of norms. And I suppose that is the process of international law. That is the social process that we rely on. I've gone on a bit of a rant. I don't know. Look, it's all complicated, and we have all of these grand concepts in international law, and whether and how they apply is uncertain. But I think the first step has to be to consider, how is a commercial entity different from a government, from a state? How are their responsibilities different? And then we go from there to think about, well, how do we work together in this collective social organization that is the world, I suppose. I don't know, Steven, save me from this.
Well, look, listening to both of you, for the first half of both of your answers, which were just fantastic, I was incredibly depressed and feeling totally irrelevant as an international lawyer because there are so many other aspects at play. But I think, from my perspective at least, you both made good saves by talking about the fact that, part of this whole mulligatawny soup of factors, you still need to have law down there. I would just say one thing on best practice, because, I'm involved at the COPOS when we're trying to draft documents and there's references made to best practice. Even that's a tough issue. That's an interpretive issue. And there are many countries that don't accept, and indeed in the mandate of our working group, they never accepted the expression best practice, because just because you do it doesn't make it a best practice, so to speak. So this, I think, reinforces what you and Chris are saying. And so we talk about existing practices, whether or not, and that takes away to us the subjective notion and the interpretive notion, but it's also politics. We know that. So Chris, there's so much in what Annie and you have said. But Annie, right towards the end there, talked about commercial entities again and the commercialization of space. And we know space is a $400 billion economy. It's growing quickly. The private sector's looking at lunar activities and celestial body activities with great interest. They're putting investment in there. They see financial returns. We're talking about the development of this so-called cislunar economy. So, Chris, is this inherent commercialization of space, and in particular when we're now talking about celestial activities, lunar activities, is that an opportunity in terms of getting greater cooperation, or indeed, as both of you have hinted, commercial entities, their bottom line is what they're interested in. They had different perspectives about what is best, what is right. So is it an opportunity, or in fact, does this increased commercialization actually add further obstacles to developing cooperative practices on the moon and elsewhere? Another easy question.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I have a couple perhaps uncoordinated thoughts. Before I practiced space law, I practiced corporate securities law in New York, and I took many corporate law classes in law school. I've definitely enjoyed them. And when you learn about what a corporation is, and how it exists as a creature of the law, and you compare it to you just come away with the idea that human beings, organize themselves and their activities in many different categories. And if people organize their pursuits and their energy and their time and their capital and their resources as an organization, as a corporation, that's neither inherently good or bad. It's just one way that people organize themselves. People organize themselves into corporations. They organize themselves into churches or religions. They organize themselves into nation states. They organize themselves into many different types of societies. So, the corporation, you can say that it's all about the bottom line, but in a sense, it's also all about just existing and being profitable and like continuing to exist and do the things that you want to do. If I had a bagel store, I'm not in it to become a millionaire. I'm probably in it because I love bagels and I love making bagels, and that's a reward in and of itself. Anyway, so I would just want to say, a nation state pursues its national interest. A corporation pursues its interest. Those interests may be enlightened or they may not be enlightened. They may be selfish or they may be altruistic, or a mix of all of many different inputs and influences. But more about this is kind of difficult, actually. When you look at the mentalities or the postures or personalities of people who want to do commercial things on the moon, it's very obvious that they see that they're ambitious, but they're also anxious. They want to be successful. They want to do what they want to do on the moon. They want to be first at it, or they want to be successful at it. They want to be sustainable at it. And so for them, their interest is, let's just make it happen. Government regulation could be burdensome. I want to get this out of the way, or I don't want to be slowed down. I don't want to be stopped because I want to be successful. And you have to respect someone who is putting all of their time, all of their capital, and really waging everything in their life on their startup company or their company to do something on the moon. They put all their chips in. They really want to make this happen. They're dedicating their life to it. And their posture is, I just want to make it happen and make it successful. I'm not going to say that's good or bad, but I recognize it as real. At the same time, let's look at the posture of people who want to, like the academics, the space lawyers, the people who are focused on space sustainability, or the people who have not put all their chips in and are dedicating their life to it. They want to do things, they want to see norms develop on the moon that are sustainable, that are peaceful, that are altruistic, that meet their own cultural ideas about what is right or just or ethical, or what is best and the good way to do things. So they literally, just personality wise, or part of their postures, they have a different position. They start from a different position, and I'm not going to say that's good or bad, but I recognize that it is real. So I would just say that let's take a look and respect where people start from, like the issues that they start from. And lastly, all I want to say is, we will see things on the moon and behaviors and activities on the moon that you may not like. So there will be somebody who does something on the moon that you go, should we really be allowing that? They're doing what on the moon? They perform what type of ceremony on the moon? Or they buried cremated human remains or cremated animal remains? Why did they do that? I'm just calling out one example. Or other people who crash desiccated microscopic life forms without telling anyone else. We all know what I'm referring to with the water bears and the tardigrades. People will do things on the moon selfishly or in a way that other people don't like. Do you have a say to stop that? If Nation A gives a license to put cremated human remains on the moon, and you're in country B, and you think that's atrocious or abhorrent or goes against your culture and your values, or you just don't like it, what right or what stance do you have to say to stop it? Again, Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty is where we start from. If it's not, if we have not agreed that it is wrong, you cannot like it, but do you have a sense of stopping it, or punishing that which happens? And I'll leave it at that. Is that we have to accept that actors will do things on the moon that there will be resistance to. And how will we respond to that? Can we set some norms beforehand? Can we agree that there's certain behaviors on the moon that we don't want to see happen beyond the non-militarization of Article 4, Paragraph 2?
Yeah, look, Chris, that is just fantastic. It's really interesting. And you mentioned the tardigrades. You became quite the king of tardigrades when all of that happened through all of your commentary. But you're absolutely right. There are so many issues, and the point that you made about, if someone gets permission under national law and it's lawful under the national law, what rights do others have? And that's an argument we've had on previous versions of this law breakfast when we're talking about, for example, national regulators allowing for masses of small satellites to be launched and, etc. That's a whole other discussion, but your point is so valid. We need to think about things in a much more out of the square than we're used to, I think, in doing that. So, Annie, before we go to the questions, I'd like to ask you something, building on everything that Chris is saying, and particularly his comment there about things will happen on the moon, let's say, that we don't like. How can we, I know in your PhD you looked at so-called dual use technology, although we all agree maybe that's not the right term, or a term that doesn't mean much. But how can we use the technology that has been developed, is being developed, will be developed, to perhaps engage in a verification process on the lunar surface, as we have verification technology for weapons of mass destruction limitation agreements, indeed using satellites. Who's going to be responsible, as Chris says, who's going to be responsible and on what basis can they enforce this notion of exclusively for peaceful purposes? Or if we don't go that far, even to stop bad behavior, whatever bad behavior might be, how can technology help to try to help us in that way?
Well, I think this is look, there are many things you could say about this, but perhaps I'll just stick to kind of some key points. So in terms of what happens, I think one thing we can learn from is, as you mentioned, the use of satellite technology to verify weapons and nuclear disarmament and so on. We also see examples of insurance companies increasingly using Earth observation imagery to verify that people are meeting their obligations. We also see it in the case of mining site remediation and operations. So those big, insurance firms, but also assurance companies that are doing audits will be able, they use this footage already. They use imagery to check Okay, so you've said that you will run your mining site according to these safety protocols. Now let me check that against this random picture that I took yesterday. Great, it doesn't line up. Now we have a chat, and that affects your bottom line as a company. So I think that, and I like remain pretty convinced that if you don't have a mechanism by which you can audit, by which you can check up on what someone is doing or something is doing, then you have to assume that they're going to do whatever is in their best financial interests, or they're going to interpret things kind of a little close to the line. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe people who go to space really are altruistic and so on. But as Chris says, what one person thinks is a responsible behavior in space might not be what someone else does. And ultimately, I think everyone is accountable. Everyone is responsible for monitoring and keeping track of what happens in space, because it's kind of like it's the moon. I mean, it's the moon. We all are a party, in a sense, to the moon just by dint of existing. So, yeah, so I mean, I'm really interested in that. I know that there are companies that, for free-range chickens, for example, that now have cameras where you can log in and you can look at the chickens and you can verify as a consumer that that chicken is like that. Fashion companies are increasingly being more radically transparent about their supply chains and their manufacturing processes, giving assurance to consumers directly, not just the regulator, that what they're doing is up to what we might consider, I'm going to go, it's not existing practice, it is best practice, or at the very least better practice, and so on. And that's how you can hold people accountable. So when it comes to space, I think there is something there around, we can have these mechanisms for keeping track of things, and it probably relies on us being able to look at what's going on, and that being made transparent and open to anyone who is interested. And that might be the way that it works. Look, I'm not going to say much more than that, because I think that there are so many questions there to get onto, and I really want to hear questions from the audience. But that's my sense of it, and yeah, interested to chat about it further, maybe in Paris at IAC.
Yeah, well, we're all going to be in Paris, and it'll be great to see so many members of the audience. We've got so many great questions. So, Torsten, I'm going to hand it to you, but first, as is our other tradition, before we go to the questions, give us your reality check. You've been hearing these wonderful guests we've got with great ideas, and the positives, the negatives. You speak to everybody who is anybody in space, Torsten, including those that have an intense interest in lunar activity. So what's your sense about the possibilities for future cooperation in lunar celestial body activities? Where do you, if you had a crystal ball, where would it go? And, on that, give us the cold, hard facts from the engineer in the room here. Yeah.
Okay, so I got the easy question. That's great. So thanks for that. So as I polished this morning my crystal ball, so I can give you all the answers, including the lottery for the weekend. So if somebody's interested. No, but honestly, I have to say, and that's very rarely, I mean, we run this now on our 10th show, and you hear me that's saying really rarely, that I'm deeply impressed how our two young fellows or colleagues here are on the ground with their opinions. It's not this academical somewhere in the back room of a courtyard or hypothetical setting. No, you are saying actually what is in the market, so that answers half of the question you ask me. I think most of us are old enough to have seen that the Google Lunar X Prize are starting and getting into fruition. I think over a course of 15 years and at the end. So if you've talked at the beginning to many of these companies or initiatives, I would say 99% of them had a clue about lunar regulation and what to do, what not to do. Thanks God, that changed dramatically. So we have an awareness, at least on a governmental level, on most of the actors level. I don't want to call it in for everyone who is doing some space activities or lunar activities at the moment. Many of them are still trying their best because it's their hobby, it's their business, there's a lot of money, there's a $1 trillion economy, what is calling them, and only them, of course. So, but I think we reached a point that we are close to come to these agreements, frameworks, guidelines Chris mentioned earlier. I think that's great. We're on a good way, and what I hope is that we nail them down, and we see it in many of the questions that came in here, that people ask for that. So where are these? So how do you see that? What is your opinion on the Artemis Accords, and so on and so forth? So what kind of law system, what kind of regulation is needed to get these things forward? I mean, my first interaction with these topics were in the Hague Working Group on space resources many years ago, where I think iSpace pushed it forward as one of the participants in the Google Lunar X Prize. And I think these building blocks, so building blocks that came out of it were a good base to drive this process forward. Am I satisfied where we are today? No, I'm not at all. I mean, we are still, we see the situation that you go to the moon and you set facts. You go to space, you go to your designated orbit and you set facts. So, and as you said, who is controlling it? Who is regulating it? Who is judging what is misbehavior or not? I think we have a number of these initiatives, and that's great, but we are still lagging our success at the end. Best example, in my opinion, is the sustainability guidelines that were adopted. Great thing, great document after 10 years of hard work, but it's a piece of paper. Where are we in the implementation? And sorry for pointing it out. It goes to most of the governments and saying, yeah, we have it in our, oh no, we don't even have a space law. But yeah, damn. So it's not that important, but hey, space is important, yeah, in general. But I think we live in a very complex time right now with all the points that you mentioned at the beginning. So space is just one minor among them. I know I didn't answer any of your question and your thought. I took the privilege to just express some ideas.
No, I think that was just brilliant. Thanks, Torsten. One of the things that I think, and then we'll go to the questions, is, there's so much excitement about, let's say, resource exploitation and whatever, and there's so many moves being made and so much effort and so much oxygen in the international and other discussions are on that issue, and less so on other issues. Why? Because the other issues are problems, sustainability issues are problems, debris is problems. Sure, there's some companies and governments that are doing the right thing, whereas lunar activities are looked at perhaps as opportunities, and people want to focus on that, and that gives rise to a whole range of issues. Anyway, we could talk forever amongst ourselves, but the most important part is now. We've got so many great questions, Torsten. Can you feed it through, and we'll get Chris and Annie to enlighten us on some of these issues. So I'll throw it to you, Torsten, to put the questions.
You know what? While I was talking and couldn't put attention to the Q&A, Chris has taken most of the questions and answered them. Yeah, I mean he's
wonderful.
Classroom, nobody likes, yeah, because he's done all that stuff already.
Oh, go, Chris! You are wonderful. Go to the top of the class. But look, can I then, while you're looking at them, one issue here, Philip asked a question about the US Space Act and the Artemis Accords, and how might we suggest that Article 1 is quote unquote fairly applied? Chris, we'll start with you, because you've talked about Artemis before, and clearly, and the US Space Act, so it's a US centric sort of question, but then how do we take the actions driven by, if you like, one of, if not the major spacefaring nation, although there are many, and how do we put that in the context of a broader framework that, or understandings or practicalities or best practice that we might need, so is it being driven by one or two countries with others following, or is it going to be inputs from everywhere, which of course, as you know, is something that I think should happen. Chris, let's start with you looking at that question.
I read it. I think that I can't answer it. That's a real that's questions too. That's why I didn't answer it. Yeah, it's about operationalizing or what are the limits of Article 1? And that, it kind of gets into some Lotus principle questions. But I mean, State A is going to do things on the moon that it wants to do in its own national interest to foster science or to foster commerce. State B is going to do other things on the moon. Let's say State B wants to build a far side observatory, and State A wants to do mining in the poles, and then State C wants to do lunar habitats also in the poles. Is there conflict between them? If that conflict becomes actually problematic, then I think Antonino pointed out that I forgot to mention due regard. And so we're going to have to know what those limits of due regard actually mean. Maybe your Article 1 freedoms end where someone else's Article 1 freedoms begin, or they end where you are not showing a due regard to another actor, and it is it's pretty. Sometimes it will be easy to say, oh, that activity causes harmful interference to that activity. You have to at least stop it or cease until that activity is done. Like, let the scientists go in, and if they want to do some lunar geology and investigation into the formation of the moon, that can only take place if the terrain is undisturbed. They can go in, or go into permanently shadowed regions in the cold traps and perform experiments that would be prejudiced or ruined if we were allowed the miners to go in first. So these things are really just on a case-by-case basis of, if I go in, do I spoil someone else's opportunity? Or if I go in, perform my experiments, and then when I leave, the next actor doesn't have their interests degraded. I think that's the only principles that I can come up with.
Yeah, I agree. And Article 1, the freedoms principle in Article 1, like everything, is not totally unfettered. And if you read the document as a whole, as you say, there are due regard requirements and responsibility requirements. It's like human rights, right? The human rights that we have, the right of free speech, is not totally unfettered, despite what some people would say. So I agree with you. And so the restraints that are there that you pointed out at the beginning are helpful in managing those freedoms. But Annie, what happens when we get it wrong? If your technology for verification doesn't work, or isn't sufficient, or there's no hotline that I can ring up and say, hey, that person's doing the wrong thing on the moon, do something about it. What happens if we get it wrong? And all of these disparate groups start doing disparate things under disparate rules, and ultimately there'll be some sort of clashes. Annie, this is the Nobel Prize. Every week I give a Nobel Prize winner. This is it. Get the Nobel Prize by answering this one.
It's not a smart answer, but I think you just got to suck it and see. I think you've just got to, at a certain point, we can spend all this time thinking about, well, how do we approach this? And what about this? And what about that? It's just at a certain point, things will happen. And then at that point, we will know when it is too much. We will know when it feels unfair. We will know when there is a breach of Article 1 because a state will take another state to court over it, or there will be diplomatic negotiations that will occur, or a company will be fined. The actual specifics, I think, can't really be nailed down until we've done some things. And I hate that, right? Because as intellectual types, all of us sit here and we think, oh, well, you can kind of solve everything intellectually before you begin. But it's like any project. You've got to do the planning. The planning is everything. And I'm not saying we don't do it. I'm saying we must do it. It's very important that we do it. And then we must understand that whatever we do, something's going to happen. You know, something is going to go bang. Someone's going to muck up some area of the moon. The thing that stops me feeling super depressed about this is that the moon's quite big. And space is very big, and maybe we just mess up a corner and then we realize we've messed it up and then we don't do that again. That's the hope, right? And so then it becomes about accountability, responsibility, learning, change, and mechanisms for that process. And so accepting that we will do everything we can to put the processes in place so that when something goes wrong, when something happens that we don't like, we know how to solve that, and we have strong institutions where we can tackle that in a way that works with the right evidence, with the right acknowledgements, and move forward and make it better from there. I think that's the best case scenario. I can't think of any other answer. It's not Nobel Prize winning, but I mean, maybe Chris has his hand up, so maybe he can do better. But that's all I've got.
Yeah, and you know, of course, there are salient lessons that have we done that on the Earth, right? You know, we've mucked up a corner of the Earth. Have we learned from that so as not to repeat those mistakes? I don't know, Chris. Okay,
No.
help humanity here, Chris. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, just as a hot pursuit, you know, you cannot study problems beforehand ad infinitum. I believe it's called the closing problem, meaning you can take in information, but at some point, you know, time only runs one way, it runs forward. You have to make a decision based on limited facts. And then looking back, you only have one set of facts to look at, and you don't have counter alternatives or counterfactuals to know how what exactly caused what. So we like Andy, points out, we have to be pragmatic about this, that we do have to take decisions and respond reflexively and iteratively to those decisions and see the consequences of those decisions. My last thought is this. It is that 2022, we are ambitious about the moon, but 2022 is also kind of a dark anniversary. The last people to go on the moon were 50 years ago in 1972. In December of 1972 is when Apollo 17 left, and it has been 50 years since we've been back. I point that dark anniversary out only to say that I want to see lunar activities absolutely blossom in my lifetime, in my professional lifetime, and that I want to see these things happen. So that's one bias that I have, is that I am impatient to see these things happen, and therefore I do want to lean towards being permissive or try those things out, see what works. And if we don't like it, then we can change our ways. But I do take into account that idea that whatever you do, even if it's only for the first time to see if it works, you set a historical precedent. And others will look to what you have done and say, oh, we're allowed to do that? Oh, if they did that, then we can do it too. So we have to think through the consequences of our actions for ourselves and for others and for the future in general, as opposed to just saying, let's see it and see if we can do this and just make ourselves famous by doing this. Others will act accordingly.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. Torsten, next question.
Yeah, only one more question. So sorry, Mark, Philip, Belinda, Frank, and Suyan for your great questions, but we can't take them because the winner is Alice Gorman, who is watching.
But we'll answer those questions offline. Down the track. Yeah.
So Alice has just a short question, really, just 9 words. So, how does the precautionary principle intersect with due regards? I think it's an easy one. Come on, guys.
Okay, who wants to start off on that? Chris? Annie?
Daring.
That's a great one. It does. How does it intersect? Very strong.
It's from Alice. Come, give us this credit. Yeah, I mean,
how does it interact? Very strongly, and in a way that complements and reinforces each other, and does not conflict or deform each other. They interact in harmony. So the general principle of do no harm, and the precautionary principle, and if you think you're going to do harm, then don't do it. I think that is a limiting thing. It even limits the due regard. Whereas if you think that you're going to cause harm to others or to the environment itself, so due regard is only to other people, other actors, but the precautionary principle is not to other actors only; it is to the environment itself, and that's the other actor. It's not just. Or that's the other entity on the moon. It is not just other actors that we have to worry about. It's the environment itself, because the environment is a protected entity and a concept in international law.
Annie, do you want to add to that?
I don't really have much to add. Maybe what I'll take the opportunity to add to it is that part of engaging, I think, in this idea of responsible behavior, due regard, precautionary principle, all of these ways of engaging responsibly in space, I think there is a kind of impetus on actors in space to actively consider these questions, even outside of regulatory burden. So even if the regulator is not asking you to do it, I think that makes very good business sense to do it. And I think that that's something that people are starting to recognize. I mean, that's probably why I have a job. And, hilariously, I was like employee number 11 at my company. And I was like, why? Why do you want me? I'm a person who deals in concepts. And the answer was, well, we're doing stuff that's new. We want to get it right. Let's think about these problems practically as well. So I think in terms of these questions of like, well, what does it mean to exercise a precautionary principle? What does it mean to show due regard? These are questions that have typically been left to states through international law to solve. But I think companies, organizations, individuals are starting to take them on as their own responsibility and think, no, actually, I have a role to play here. I can think about solving this as well. And that's a really positive step, and one that I think needs to be encouraged, if only because it means that, sociologists like me can find gainful employment after PhDs, which no one saw coming. So it's very exciting stuff.
Yeah, if I could just add, and then we'll pass back to Torsten. Such a great question. I mean, they are related, but they're different. Precautionary principle is all about, well, we don't know what the risk really might be. And so we're going to err on the side of caution and not go ahead, let's say, right? And that, as Chris quite rightly says, is all about environmental protection. A really good example of that, although you wouldn't think so sometimes with some of the publicity, is the whaling treaty, because it's all about, you should, if there's a risk, then you do less, you sit back. Due regard isn't about risk in the same way. Due regard it says, I think it's narrower, it's different, but they are related. Due regard sort of says, okay, I'm going to do something. Who else is this going to affect? And okay, I'll take that into account, whatever that may mean. It doesn't really stop me from doing things. I'm not, it might mean I alter what I do, but and in fact, I can even ignore it. I might know about it. I might have engaged in some form of due diligence, but I'll still go ahead anyway, having quote unquote taken it into account. So it's not as restrictive as the precautionary principle. And people often say, well, we should use the precautionary principle in space. But because there are so many unknowns in space, as Chris and Annie have said, a precautionary principle may, to some perspectives, mean that we're not going to do things if we adhere to it. And as Chris said, we all want to do things in space, albeit that they should be sustainable, etc. Again, I'll stop there because I know there's many other points that could be made. Torsten, we've gone way overboard. Those questions that we haven't answered, and I apologize, we will take them on board and get back to Frank and all of the others, Mark, who have asked the questions, but we've run out of time. So it's been fantastic. Chris and Annie, it's just been a brilliant conversation. I'll say thank you again in a minute, but first over to you, Torsten.
Yeah, I think the question of Alice raised more questions than answers.
Yeah.
Get us answers, but hey, that's the idea. And maybe, Steven, we should rethink about the format here, giving more time for the interaction. I mean, we can't run it over 2 hours, of course, but because most of us have a job. But I think the interaction with our wonderful audience is great. So, Chiara, are you with us? Yeah.
Of course.
You're in the
Yes,
house.
I've been listening actively and taking notes because this is all very, very interesting for my own master's thesis. So thank you for that. It's been a real pleasure to listen, and I think I've learned a great deal.
I mean, you're in a wonderful position to even ask the questions you need to answer for your master's thesis by the experts.
Yeah, I know. It's great. I'm in a wonderful position.
Make sure you quote properly, though, okay?
Of course. Yeah.
Thanks for putting this up. Let me just say thank you to everybody. And our next Space Cafe Law Breakfast. I mean, how can it get better than today? But we've just got 2 amazing people coming up again. It'll be in November. We've got Olga Volenskaya, who I know is in the audience. Olga, we're thinking of you and hope you're well, and it'll be fantastic to have this conversation. So Olga Volenskaya is an incredible lawyer and has worked in many different ways in space law. And my dear friend also, Lucien Rapp, from University of Toulouse, who's a professor of law there and really looks at incredibly interesting economic questions about law. So that's going to be a great discussion on the 24th of November. There'll be more details coming. And I think Torsten will be in a nice cafe in Toulouse. So that will be good for that one. So I hope everybody can join us for that. Over to you, Chiara.
Thank you so much. Yes. So on the subject of upcoming events, we have a great list of next events coming up this month. And we are back from the summer break with our 33-minute format. So next week on the 16th of August, we'll have our 33 minutes with Professor Kai Overschroger. So Torsten, how do you feel? Excited, nervous? Do you have anything you'd like to share with us for this session?
Of course. I mean, I'm always nervous to have these wonderful guests, and I mean, in this case, being back from the holidays and having one of the really heavy weights of European space in the first Space Cafe, that means a lot. So, and to make it even more memorable for all of us, we will broadcast with Kai-Uwe live from our studio in Potsdam. So no Zoom. Okay, Zoom for you in the audience, but we will be seeing each other in the studio and can really poke each other. So that will be pretty cool. And you ask about news. So I will continue the 33 minutes now, just every second week now. So less Torsten in front of a camera. So to save your time. Good. Back to you. There are more to say.
Yes, because just a day later after this great session, we will have our next Space Cafe Austria on the 17th of August, which is by Judith Delaney. And she'll be talking to Christian Klosch on the topic of space junk or a museum object. How important is our shared space history? and this session will take place in German. Then on the 23rd of August, we have two really great events. So we'll have our very first Space Café Singapore in the morning at 9 a.m. Central European Summertime by Lynette Tan, who will be talking to Mani Thiru of Amazon Web Services on what's happening in Singapore space. And then later that day, we will have our next Space Café Israel by Mehdad Pariente, who will be talking to Dr. Anna Heller. And their subject is the story of the high school nanosatellite program that became a legend, with the message to never give up on your dreams. And then on the 30th of August, we'll have the next 33 minutes with Davide Petrillo, answering or attempting to answer the question, is there enough room for youth in the European space sector? And how does the Space Generation Advisory Council see the situation? And then on the 2nd of September, we'll have our next event by the Space Arbitration Association by Laura Yvonne Zielinski, who's also in the audience today. And her panel will be talking about the question, can space arbitration protect space investments? So as always, all our events are going to be online on Eventbrite. And we love to hear your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up for our daily and our biweekly newsletters. And if you want to treat yourselves to something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us out in the supporter program. Yes, Steven is showing the wonderful Space Watcher t-shirts. Again, thank you all so much for your interest today. A huge thank you to Annie and Chris for this inspiring and insightful chat and for being our guests in this 10th episode. Steven, thanks so much. Have you been happy with the program today?
Oh, it was just the best. Chris, Annie, thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. And Chris, thanks for introducing us to bagels, etc. But I really like the idea of Chris, when you were talking about selling bagels yourself. I like the idea of Chris's bagels. I think that'd be, in your next life, perhaps. But Chris and Annie, your thoughts and insights are just, as Torsten said, so grounded and helpful, and I know everybody enjoyed it. I certainly did, and I learned from you, and thank you again. So yeah, it was a great show, and the next one will also be good, but we just got to keep it going. Thank you.
We will probably see Chris selling bagels on the moon then.
Well, again, thanks so much. And also thanks to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week in and week out. I hope that you all stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being so active with all your questions and in the chat. I hope to see you all during the next weeks in our next events and even in person at the IAC. And in the meantime, visit our website, follow us on social media, and don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you very much.